Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit.
Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and my co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're talking about being on the embodied spiritual path, and what does that actually mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? All the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. In this week's episode, we're exploring a listener's question around anger. Many people have been exposed to the damaging effects of anger in their world. Others have been taught that anger is at best a useless emotion and at worst a dangerous one. Over time, we can begin to label anger as wrong or unspiritual, essentially something evolved people don't feel. Yet, as this listener shares in her letter to us, anger can also be an important step in healing and in reaching a genuine place of forgiveness. Join us in our conversation exploring the differences between feeling and acting from anger, understanding anger as a boundary, and how we can also meet this often maligned emotion with heart. If you're enjoying the show, we would love it if you would become a supporting member at patreon.com/bliss and grit. We also completely and totally appreciate it when all of you leave reviews on iTunes or on our Facebook page, which is also at Bliss and Grit. You can head over to the website, blissandgrit.com, to see our resources and also to subscribe to our weekly digest. One last thing before we head into the conversation, Brooke and I have been known to curse, and I do believe we might have cursed up a storm in this one. So if you're in mixed, non-swearing company, you may want to pop in some headphones. Okay, here we go. Well, hello, darling.
Hello.
Your microphone does sound extra special today.
Yeah, I have a new microphone, everyone. It's pretty exciting, unless it sounds creepily sharp and weird. So we'll see.
And we will learn.
Okay.
Well, Brooke and I have been completely occupied with all sorts of things, all sorts of life stuff. And so when we were talking today, we're like, what is it we want to speak about? I mean, normally we're kind of in the midst of exploring something for ourselves, since we try to use ourselves as reference points. And there wasn't really anything we were vibing on. So we remembered that quite a while back now, thank you for your patience, dear listener, one of our listeners sent us a question about anger. And it's such a beautiful, powerful, and honest question, and she gave us permission to share it all with you. So I'm going to go ahead and read this beautiful note that she wrote us, and then we're going to dive into talking about our experiences around anger. Like that?
I love it. Let's do it.
Okay. So our listener writes, I love your show so much, and I'm wondering about a topic that you haven't seemed to cover on its own, although it's been certainly touched upon a bunch: anger. I've gotten to a point where in examining my anger, it's shown me that I am deeply afraid of truly feeling the anger. One huge reason is that I'm afraid of what it will do to me. My rage and anger have been stuffed down since I was a baby crying in the playpen and nobody came to get me, and since I was sexually abused when I was 5 years old. I have raged that my mother didn't hold me much and look into my eyes as a baby. And yet, as I am seeing clearly, I don't know how to make space for this because a healthy model of anger is something I've never witnessed. My mother had rage that caused her to hit people and objects and still causes her to snap and yell at my father. I feel like I've adopted a strong sense of a quote unquote psychological agenda via Pema Chodron to not snap or yell at someone because of the irreparable damage that does. Short of yelling into a pillow, which is still hard for me to tap into even with my Hakomi therapist, I'm struggling with the non-shadow side of anger. What is its role in acceptance? I've been stepping over it to try to jump ahead to the forgiveness phase, and I actually thought that was working until recently. Now with compassion, I see that I've done everything to avoid feeling that anger, which is clearly an important step in healing. Okay, so pretty powerful letter, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much for writing it, if you're listening.
Yes, and normally I just kind of volley it to you, but I won't do that to you right off the bat this time, dear Brooke. I think I want to say to our listener that I so relate to this. I mean, this is so personal for me. I grew up with a very angry parent. I dare say it's reasonable to say my father was a rageaholic. And I guess I say it like that because if any of you have ever experienced somebody who's seized by a fit of anger or seized by rage, there's a sense that the person you once knew is no longer there. It's like the same way as if someone's on drugs and they feel altered or alcohol or something. It's like the person you knew and loved seems to disappear from view. And so I grew up with a father that was like that. And all sorts of things happen when you grow up around anger. I also felt really afraid of wielding anger myself. I went through phases in life, some where I was too angry, some where I had zero anger because I pushed it down. I mean, there's just so much I could talk about. I'm just going to start with like kind of the umbrella view. But the other thing is we can really fear being the perpetrator. You know, my father, in some ways, I love him. I'm close to him. But in my childhood, in many ways, he was the perpetrator for me, for my sisters, for my mother. And we fear the energy inside of us that can feel familiar to the person who perpetrated something that we witnessed that was very harmful to us or to others. Which is such a weird scenario, right? Because anger is just an emotion. And everybody at some moment might have that energy cycle through them. Either because it's your own and it's justified, or it's your own and it was triggered, or simply because you're in the field of energy of anger. Like at some point, a human's going to have anger come through them. And when you've been through these types of childhood experiences, you come to associate that feeling with, I am like that perpetrator. And if I was to embody this or feel it or let it run through me, I will become that perpetrator and I can then only create harm. And I have just so much to say about this. So I'm going to go ahead and say this and pause and make space for you to kind of step in. But I think it's very relatable, and I would bet it doesn't apply to just this conversation of growing up with angry people in your household, but rather at large, it's a very big fear to become like our perpetrators in some way, shape, or form sometimes.
Yeah, and well, so many things. I think you and I are both like, oh my God, so much to say about our own experiences. Like this is something that's really alive. And there's, you know, just to touch on what you were getting into just then, there's a way that if we fear it, which is a perfectly reasonable conclusion for the mind to have come to, like, don't do that. Don't make that choice. Don't be that person. Because only harm comes from it, then it holds it in place, because then of course, like we can't ever listen to what it might want to say. We can't ever welcome it. We can't, you know, have any experience with it because it's just to be feared. And, you know, as you mentioned, it has this quality of like demonic possession, you know, like it's something suddenly comes in and it's out of control and you don't know what you're dealing with. It's not like rationality is an option. So I think anger can be one of our strongest emotions that we
put a lid on or hold at bay, and then it can't ever communicate with us what it's trying to communicate. And so maybe just start, because I was going to talk about like the emotion for me that I very much try to hold at bay is anxiety. Like, don't let anxiety take over everything. And so then I can't feel what is the anxiety and blah, blah, blah. So we could do this with other emotions as well for those listening who don't particularly relate to anger. But I think anger is a super important one to talk about in any kind of spiritual community, because there's a lot of spiritual bypass around anger being the enemy, and that the good ones or the spiritual ones are the people who don't feel anger. You know, all of the equanimity stuff, all of the slow blink stuff. And yet, since anger is a part of the human experience, you know, since it's here, it must be something that's supposed to be a part of the human experience. Like, it's just really straightforward that way. It doesn't mean it doesn't cause a lot of suffering internally and externally. It's very painful, but to decide that there are certain things that are required to turn away from doesn't really make much sense. So maybe to begin, we can talk about like, what are some of the gifts of anger? What are some of the things that anger shows up to communicate? And then also address the fear that we can have around having had these very scary experiences, like the demonic possession, I'm not safe or they're not safe kind of feelings of anger. You know, for me, one of the things that helps me so much about anger is that it's when I see it as information, that emotion is trying to give me some information about discerning something in my life. So in the present moment, it can be something going on that anger is saying no to. So it can be all of the things of our lives, right? A relationship, a job, just a particularly stressful time of our lives. And anger can arise as a way of saying, my boundaries are really being pushed up against here. They're not being respected. I need to articulate a boundary, and I need to tell you something's really, really pushing at me in a gnarly, unpleasant way. You know, so as soon as I start to think of anger as something that's trying just to deliver information to me, then I can start to get curious about like, what might it be trying to deliver? Like, is there a circumstance that I unconsciously was putting up with just because it is a circumstance that felt like familiar white noise that I need to turn towards and say, this is not okay for me. I'm overwhelmed. And, you know, I was watching, and we'll put this in the show notes, the talk by Matt Kahn that was like the first one released from the retreat you were just on with him. And he was talking about anger can arise like as a way of when you really need to have self-care. He may have also been talking about other emotions, sadness or anxiety. I can't remember. But if there's this explosive quality inside of you, internal pressure that you can feel, maybe the other thing it might just be saying, if you can't say like, oh, I need to quit my job, or like some big obvious thing in your environment, maybe it's just saying, I really need to go take care of myself. I really need to carve out some time where I'm not pressurized, where I can just like go and be with this emotion and remove yourself from the feeling of I might cause harm. For example, if it's like you're in your household and your people are around or whatever, and you just feel this rage, you can articulate, I'm feeling this. I'm going to go take care of myself. I'm going to give myself a grown-up timeout. So to begin with, just thinking of anger as something that communicates with us in the present tense can be really, really a helpful discernment, I think.
I remember the first time one of my therapists said to me, anger is simply your sign that your boundaries have been violated. It's like the alarm bells. I remember like surprised, like, oh gosh, that makes so much sense. It's so simple. But I think when you've been harmed by anger in some way, shape or form, either your own that felt really out of control or somebody else's, you don't understand the simplicity of what that messaging system is. It's like, look around. Something's a boundary violation. Now, sometimes I violated my boundary. Sometimes someone else did. I mean, you have to come with that kind of level of curiosity to start to understand it. But I remember, having grown up in a house with anger, where like only two emotions were okay. It was like, I think a lot of Italian families are like this. You could be happy, you could be angry. Everything else is kind of hidden under covers and definitely discouraged, all of the softer emotions. And I know Italians in Italy may not be like this, but something about the Italian Americans, I don't know what it is. And so then I became somebody who had a very short fuse. And I would like blow up a lot, almost always because I felt like someone disrespected me. Talk about intergenerational repetition, right? Like, oh my God, that person rolled their eyes at me. And then I would black out in a rage, like black out, like scream things, curse things. I mean, I've been known to get to bar fights, climb up walls to jump on people. Like, I mean, really crazy shit. That was total reenactments of growing up in a household where rage was so common, when fear was so common, when like punishing people through like showing them, how bad they were, how wrong they were was like the way. And, P.S., my dad also was punched in the face by my grandfather. And P.S., I'm sure this has like got a long history of it. So then I remember one day I was living in Hawaii and I was like 21 and I was working at a Gold's Gym at the front desk and someone came up and said something sassy to me. I can't even remember what they said, but all of a sudden, black rage filled my body the way it would. And I was cursing at the front desk of this gym that I worked at, yelling at this guy. And I don't remember what I said. I don't remember what it was about, but I remember waking up the next morning with a total guilt hangover, like just that extreme shame of how could I do this and what kind of person am I? And am I like the perpetrator, my dad, who was the origin for me? So then I remember making a decision. I'm never going to be angry again. And it was like a clear, conscious decision. And you can find so many spiritual teachings to support it. And like, I think that what our listener was pointing to is like, might point to it. Like there's no usefulness in anger. And when I studied Chinese medicine, they recognize anger as a natural emotion, but they don't think it's good for you to feel it. It's not good for your health. It's not good for your well-being or your sanity. So they're pretty much always cautioning you against anger. So here I was, a young woman who decided anger's bad and I'm just never going to do that again and never be that person. And I had all of these wonderful spiritual teachings to back me up, right? I remember I had a boyfriend cheat on me when I was like 24 and I never felt angry about it. I mean, I felt compassion. I felt all the things. But meanwhile, my body was like seething with this like heat that was burning up and like I was breaking out in rashes. So eventually, of course, I had to come to some kind of a more harmonious relationship with this feeling. Not like you were saying something to the effect of when you don't acknowledge it, it can keep just like, it has a certain level of ownership on you, whether you're pushing it away or pulling it towards you, whether you're putting it on or trying to like keep it buried at the bottom of a pile. Either way, it's like, it's got a certain amount of ownership in your space. Right. And so I remember John Wellwood saying once, like, what's the point of feeling your feelings? Is like, well, you have them.
Right. I always love that one. So good.
Yeah. Right. So good. So it's like, well, I clearly have some anger. Because it would get tripped. And then like guys I was dating would be like, you're scary when I'd get upset with them. And I'm like, okay, something's going on, And it's quite a journey to recognize how to meet these types of things. I mean, the first step was recognizing that feeling anger and acting from anger were two completely different things. Yeah. I'd never known they were separate, right? Like you feel anger and out comes words or punches or kicks or like whatever the natural energy of anger was. I'd never witnessed someone. I don't think I ever witnessed in my life someone have a feeling but not act out from that feeling earlier on. That's crazy, right?
Totally. Yeah. We don't get a lot of orientation around that, do we? That it's possible to feel something and not
and contain it. I mean, I think that's kind of like when we talked about every emotion, whether it be sadness or anxiety or grief or anger, there's this place that we start to access as we develop our psychological maturity and as we learn how to sit with ourselves and contain energy. That's like all of these different emotions can go through us and not necessarily cause us to take action. You know, we can feel sadness even without falling on the floor crying, right? Like these interesting things that don't occur to you when you don't have that role modeling, or maybe when emotions are so big in your system and it takes quite a bit of skill or finesse to get there. Not really sure. But with anger especially, I don't know if I ever had someone say, well, you know, I'm angry right now. I'm going to need 10 minutes, like give me an hour. I'll come back and talk to you. You know, nobody did anything wrong. Like you have never had someone coach through. It was usually just someone like flying off the handle, right?
Right.
So I think it starts with recognizing feeling your feelings and acting in a certain way are two different things, just starting there.
Yeah, because anger is, every emotion moves quickly, but anger is like freight train fast, or not freight train, Acela is the fast one.
It can be, especially if you're loaded with reactivity in your system and it hits that like super sensitive trigger on you. It could be 0 to 100.
Yeah, for sure. And like I witnessed some of that in my family, and I've certainly acted that out myself. The quickness of, you don't realize until it's over that you had this big anger offload. So the ability to, you know, one of the other things that comes up around that, because I think we can feel sometimes that anger is, we do the bucket thing, like my bucket's full of anger, right? Like there's so much in there. There's so much muck to dig through. It goes through the generations of my family. It's what I experienced as a child. It's what I felt but never felt allowed to express, or when I do express it, I cause harm. So one of the other ways that we can really hold it in place is by telling ourselves unconsciously, like, if I turn towards this, it's the never-ending project. You know, emptying the bucket is going to be hard and take forever and be very painful and potentially cause harm because I'm opening Pandora's box, right? And so I think also just recognizing that there are these underlying thought forms about it too. When we can see those with a little tenderness and just inject the idea, like, is that totally true? And I'm not saying that it's not going to be potentially painful, and that learning how to turn towards really large emotions that we have all kinds of opinions about not wanting, like anger, that's not challenging, because it is. It's really, really challenging. But we don't have to hold in place this idea of like, it's the big project, and if I open Pandora's box, all is lost. Because like you're saying, Vanessa, just noticing that you're having the feeling instead of acting it out begins to take it apart, begins to slow it down. And not so that the end goal is the one who always sits in perfect peace on their cushion while anger courses through their body, because I don't think that's a worthy goal either. But being able to slow down in a moment where you don't create harm in your environment, like you said, you know, modeling something like, I'm really sorry, my fuse is short right now. I need to take a pause, take a break. That is a huge deal to be able to do that. And, you know, in my experience, because this is something that I've wrestled with like the last 2 years, it's just been a lot of really big, very unpleasant emotions in my physical body. So I can have that feeling sometimes, like I did open some Pandora's box by accident. And now I just have to feel all this ick that's in here from whatever, who knows really. But like the story that I tell myself is a history of trauma and blah, blah. But who knows really? Maybe I'm just feeling everything else that's out in the collective. I don't know. Who knows? but it feels really unpleasant. And I've had to do, it's an ongoing journey, right? Like I don't have on lock the perfect solution to how to withstand or alchemize large, painful emotions like anger or despair or shame, or things like that. But I've had to keep tinkering with. And it's not always the same, right? Like, it's not like I figured out the one thing that always works and great. Like, I have the magic wand in my back pocket for when rage comes up or shame comes up. But there are a few things that have helped. I mean, one is just acknowledging, I feel this. This is happening. And making that not a problem, because what happens very quickly before I even really acknowledge that I'm feeling it are all of the judgments about how I shouldn't be and how I should have figured out how to unhook it already. And what's wrong with me and why can't I? And will this be a big project and all of those things. So those move also lightning fast. If I can touch into a place where I don't have to make it a problem, and in my experience, that's like a toggling. I have moments of that and I have moments of not that. So it goes back and forth. Then I can get a little curious about what I might need. Sometimes I've needed rest, where I need to not have any social things on the calendar. Like if I'm supposed to be going out with friends for dinner, I need to cancel that and just be willing to be in the bedroom meditating. Sometimes I need to do laugh fest. Like I need to go home and watch something like stand-up comedy. I love comedy. That's going to make me laugh. And that gets the energy moving from the inside out. And then, another thing that can help me sometimes is movement. Actual, like go on a really long hike or just do some high intensity interval training at home or slowly lift weights, but actually physically moving my body. I find that anger is the kind of thing that I feel like I need to do something physical for it to be able to move through. And then one time I took a stack of china plates that I have in my house and went out to the garage. This was a particularly bad moment last summer. I just couldn't get it to move for like days. And I went out to my garage and just smashed the plates. It was so satisfying. It helped so much. Sounds so dumb. Sounds like such bad advice. But I was alone in my garage. So my son didn't witness, oh my God, my crazy mom's having a nervous breakdown. So it didn't harm him. It's just me and my garage and some plates and a broom. And for whatever reason, the action of doing that. So it's not a logical emotion. No emotions are. And so I haven't found that there's like a one size fits all. But if we can acknowledge that we're having it and see what might feel even a little relieving, which means we have to slow way, way, way down. Like I can't have a plan of how I'm going to manage it or tackle it or make it go away. I have to get really right here, right in this moment. Do I need to go for a walk? Do I need to meditate? Do I need to laugh? Do I need to smash plates? What are the things right now that actually feel like literal experiential physical relief in my body and that don't hurt anyone?
Well, I think that sometimes, so if we're talking about anger, on the one hand, why do we have to find relief, right? Like in a sense, like if our emotions are communicating to us, and especially if our emotions are just, right? There's a lot of shit to feel angry about in this world. So then why do we need relief? And I think that what can be useful to bring in is maybe the problem with anger, and I use that word problem with a quote unquote, with anger, is that when we're seized by anger, what's happening is our reptile brain kicks in and it starts to call the shots. And it doesn't see through the present moment lens. Like the reptile survival brain's only capable of seeing through the past and projecting onto the future. And what happens is we don't have present moment based clarity, or what we could call discernment. When the reptile brain is in action, it's always us versus them, good versus bad, winner, loser, right, wrong, should, shouldn't. And so our thinking gets reduced to dualism and kind of binary codes. So what happens is when we're really in the heat of anger, I mean, in the heat, like when Brooke was talking about overwhelming emotions, like if anger's grabbed us and we're like in it, we almost can't even differentiate us and anger, then we won't ever really see clearly in that moment. It doesn't mean the message isn't important. It doesn't mean that the feelings are wrong. It just means that even when we're trying to discern, like, what do I do with this? It's hard to like see clearly. So in a way, anger is this unique emotion in that it's telling us something is wrong.
Yeah.
Right? Something's feeling violated. Now, sometimes I am angry because I've betrayed my own boundaries. I've said yes to too many things. I'm annoyed someone even asked me because I don't know how to say no. Sometimes there's this internal origin, but a lot of times it could be someone was disrespectful to you. You're mad at what's happening in the culture or the collective or all the injustices in the world, whatever the case may be. So the next thing is, okay, I have this feeling. This doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel fair. It doesn't feel just, doesn't feel appropriate. And then the next question, so what do I do with it? And the problem is, as you're seized by anger, you'll never move with the most clear way of assessing everything and determining what's for the highest. And so in a way, we need it. And it's funny because I guess whenever I talk about all other emotions, I'm really meeting it with love. And in the sense, I mean that with anger. Like, we don't need to meet our anger with judgment. Like, anger's not some bad thing. Thank God we have this protective system that says, hey, this is not right. Not yours, not for you. Or, hey, Vanessa, can you stop betraying yourself over and over again? Whatever it is. So there's nothing wrong with anger. But usually I try to meet my emotions without agenda. As in, like, don't relieve. But sometimes when you're in the thick of anger, you just need to be able to take a couple of breaths before you can get any sort of different relationship with yourself. Then, once you can, like, at least take 3 deep breaths and you're starting to settle, now you can have this whole interesting experience. What part of you is angry? Is there a part? Can you see it? How far back does this anger go? Did it trigger something? Is this familiar feeling? And then you might, if it was, like for me, let's say it brought up a part of my childhood where I'm really angry because I felt like a 5-year-old who was disempowered and scared for her life. And I can see that part of myself. And I could say to her in all genuineness, like, you don't need to change. You don't need to be anything for me. Feel what you feel. I love you. And I can actually now turn towards anger with love. And then there can be a softening. And that's a very beautiful thing. It's just sometimes we need to be able to like take a couple of breaths and like be present in our body to get to that phase of a healing or of just a presence practice. I feel like sometimes with spiritual teachings, this is like my current thought. We'll see. My current thought is there are these beautiful spiritual teachings: forgiveness, compassion, love, non-attachment. Non-attachment in a way creates non-anger because you're not attached to the outcome, so you can't really get that mad. And, interconnectivity. Interconnectivity can unplug a lot of anger because we're all one and we understand that we're human and we're doing the best we can. And like, if I hurt you, I hurt me, and all these other things. So there are these beautiful, beautiful spiritual, we could say truths, and we could also just use the word ideals just for the sake of this conversation. And the thing I start to feel is like, that's where we land at some point naturally. Like they're almost pointing to something we land at. And there's really good processes around them. Like I love Buddhist meditations around loving kindness, and I love forgiveness practices like Ho'oponopono. And they can soften us and they can open up aspects of ourselves, like our soul or our hearts. And I think that's all beautiful. But it's almost like it's skipping something. Like it's skipping the whole phase where first we turn away from nothing inside of ourselves. Like we're first. The real healing happens when we are not separate from life and our feelings are not separate from us. And these traumas and reactivities that live in our system or that arise in the moment are not condemned as bad or useless or unworthy or less exalted or less spiritual. So much damage has gotten done that way. And that only arises again from a divided mind that's judging one emotion is good, one is bad, one is useful, one is not. And what I've noticed for myself is as I've learned to be able to be with myself and my anger, which at some point involved me screaming into pillows, super embarrassingly. P.S. to our listener who wrote the question, with my Hakomi therapist. And, gone through those processes and met myself and admitted as a little child how hard some of these things were on me and admitted shit, y'all, what it's like to be a woman in this culture sometimes and how hard that can be. And all of these different things that have happened to us over the course of our lives. The first step, always and forever, see if this sounds true to you, Brooke, always and forever, the first most helpful step I've seen over and over again in my life with different instances and different moments is learn to turn towards yourself with as much kindness as you can muster. And if you can't do kindness, start with tolerance and just learn to be present with who you are and whatever is arising in you, because it is always arising for some reason. Some reason. It's got something. So we turn towards it with curiosity. After that happened, all sorts of things happen. I'm more naturally compassionate, more naturally forgiveness. Like forgiveness for my parents one day just arose. It wasn't like a forced practice, and it shook me up. And then now I'm at the stage where actually anger doesn't arise for me a lot. It's not that I don't see injustices. It's not that I don't discern what I believe is harmful and what I believe is helpful. It's just anger's not an emotion that arises that much anymore. I don't think anger is necessarily something that we all have to have, but I do think I had to go through an honest meeting of who I am and what was in me and what it means to be human before all of these more exalted, beautiful, benevolent states could be genuine.
Yeah. Yeah, because the mind loves to make a goal. It does it automatically and instantaneously. And it's so obvious to those of us who are sensitive, caring people that, of course, the goal would be to be the calm one.
Yes.
But
we
nice
don't want to be taken over. I mean, you can feel,
right.
Well, actually, some people love anger, and we should footnote that and come back to that. But for a lot of us who have the good person identity or the calm person, or we just want to be even
types,
Steven.
The sensies. We want to be the nice, easygoing one all the time, obviously. It's so obvious. But we can't just make that the goal. We can't just make that the Halloween costume we're going to wear. We want to, and if you're anything like me, you'll try many times to put on a costume and then, 4 months later go, oh, I was putting on the costume of the nice one who never feels big emotions. I've done it a million times. So it's a totally natural thing to do. The problem is that it does not get at the root. And we talk all the time about meeting ourselves and meeting our humanity, and it's just a place that words truly fail, because we can talk about that and it can be so frustrating to listen to because it doesn't instantaneously give the experience of being able to go into ourselves and meet our hardest emotions and our hardest spots and to discover, can we discover tenderness? Can we discover love for those places in ourselves? It's such a individual and, of course, completely experiential journey that it's not like we talk about here's how plenty, but it's not an obvious hand someone the blueprint and away they go. In my experience, I talk about this with clients. I talk about this with you as a friend and with other friends. I talk about it here in public as a show that I'm really devoted to. Like, this is something that occupies a lot of this lifetime for me. And it's still a dance. You know, I still come up against plenty of things that I'm like, I give up. I don't know how to meet this. You know, you and I were talking about this on a personal call right before the show, that I'm just at a place where I'm like experiencing a lot of hard emotions again. And it just feels like I give up. Is there a eject button I can push to get off the planet? Because I'm so sick of meeting all the hard emotions. So it's normal to feel that too. And then, you know, at the end of the day, what else am I going to do? Like, at some point, the fever will break, so to speak, and I will be able to discover what this batch of hard emotions has to show me. Not because I need to forever be emptying the bucket, but just because for me individually, like, that's just genuinely what's happening today. And then love will arise and tenderness will arise internally, always first. And then it starts to naturally happen in the world more, like you said. So I wish that I could wholesale hand it over, you know, but it's something we have to explore for ourselves. And just to point out another differentiation that we're making here a little bit, there can be anger that comes up that is like this redlining it, part of ourselves that's really trying to call our attention to something going on that needs to be changed, something that's intolerable to our system. So it can be a way that we are crossing our own boundaries, overgiving, over caretaking, under self-caring, whatever it might be. And then there are things in our lives, you know, we can have abusive workplaces. We can have partnerships that feel that they're at their end and we just don't know how to end that partnership. And we're angry at ourselves or we're angry at them. There can be all these myriad of things that it's so convenient, the mind says, to ignore it and just let it go on. And I think that what anger is trying to burst the bubble of is, it's okay, I can tolerate it. It's okay, I can tolerate it. And then anger comes along and it's just saying, no, you can't. It's intolerable. Well,
certainly, like, it's a very mobilizing energy, right?
Right. It's like let me
in a
show
way,
you.
Anger's like, take some action, right? Like,
right.
move.
Yeah. Enough. We're done.
Yeah.
Let me push up against you.
Very different than depression or sadness. Like, anger's like gets you going.
Yeah.
Right?
It's trying to unclog some drain. So it could be something going on in your current environment that you really just need to look at and be willing and able to take action towards. And then there can also be the patterns, right? Of like growing up in a household with somebody who had anger,
or someone who mistreated you or abused you.
Exactly. Like all of that residual anger that didn't get met because you weren't able to in all innocence at that time. You just didn't have the skills to be able to turn towards it. It was pure survival mode. Very normal that we all have that. And so, you know, there can be this backlog too. And I think that what I've been dealing with for the last couple of years is backlog, you know? And so they have a little bit of a different action, because one is you need to see the tangible thing in your world that is intolerable, whether it's a way you're treating yourself or something that's happening in your world. And then what are you willing to do to change the intolerable thing? You can't outrun what's intolerable. It's just intolerable. And then the other is, okay, my system, my physical self has these sensations that didn't get met at some point, and they're asking to be met now. And like I was saying before, for me, that has involved more of things like somatic meditation, actual physical movement, smashing plates, whatever it might be in any given instance. That's a little bit different because it can feel a little agitating because it's like, my life's fine. My life's great on the surface of things. And yet I feel this arising again in my system and I don't know what to do. So it can be a little more like lost in a hall of mirrors kind of feeling.
Well, we talk a lot on the show about stored emotions, right? So it's like we can inherit, we can create, however you want to say it. It's probably all of it. We can even empath, emotions, and they can be unprocessed, stored emotions that live in our system. And so that means two things. One, just like what you're describing, Brooke, that at some point, as we keep getting more and more aware, we're just aware of these energies or feelings that are living in our soma. But there's another way, is that it's almost like I found like they can live like reactivities in your system. Like as I start to explore the role of the nervous system more in awakening, I'm taking this class with a teacher named Neelam, which is interesting. I just started it. It's about awakening in the nervous system, because it's almost like we have these reactivities over time, and it could be all sorts of pain. It doesn't have to just be, I have anger that's been stored, but I can have anger, and I can have grief, and I can have sadness, and I can have aloneness, and I can have not seenness, and not heardness, and not witness, and I can have, rage and grief, all these things. And all of these feelings can sort of store in our system in such a way that our nervous system becomes hyper reactive, our breath becomes shallow, and then we're even more easily triggered, which is just this interesting thing. And then, with anger, I think we're mentioning it, but I just want to highlight, like, the crazy part is identity gets really woven in with emotions sometimes. I am the sad one, I am the angry one, or I am the never angry one. And it really can go both ways. And what's interesting is anger in our culture, it can either be in spiritual circles, like, oh, anger is a problem, don't be angry, it's bad. Or it could even be lauded as like, you should be angry, anger is powerful. Like, what I always find interesting is when I tell people stories about how angry I used to be, and like really like get into fights in public places, kind of angry person, people love those stories. They want to hear more. I think that's really interesting.
You're like, really?
That was like intergenerational trauma rolling downhill into like really unfortunate moments, And I remember when me and my ex were going through our divorce, there were some things that y'all would probably not have blamed me for being angry at. But I remember when like I wasn't angry, people being like, you should be angry, like that was the powerful energy, right? Mm-hmm. So then identity is funny, because just like our listener wrote, she can cling to the identity of the non-angry person because that's more convenient for the way her system feels safe. Like, oh, I'll be the compassionate one, so I'm not the perpetrator or harmful or a bad person. But it can go the other way. Our system can feel safe if we are the angry one. We are the one who no one is going to give us shit, and we're not going to take shit from anyone, and we are in control. And believe me, since I've been someone with anger, you can feel quite powerful in that moment. I mean, look at the number of harmful people in this universe who feel powerful in their intolerance and anger, right? In their hate, like they feel empowered by what they're willing to do from that energy. And we can have just the slightest version of that. That's the extreme, but the slightest version of identifying with our anger as us, as who we are, and as a good thing. Or we can have it as pushing it away. And that's what makes all of these things so subtle, so nuanced. Like, how do we make space for it? How do we change what may be pointing to us to be changed if it's within our power? But also, how do we start to sort through where we've identified where our identity and our ego mechanism that goes, it's more convenient and safe and better to be this way, operates? Because I think that's what a lot of emotions are. Like when you get into Buddhist Tantra, like Vajrayana Buddhism, maybe true for yogic philosophy, I'm not as familiar. They think of all emotions as sacred, that everything, anger is the seed of something that births something else, right? And we have protector deities, and there's goddesses like Kali, like there's all of these things to point towards. All emotions are just energy, and they can all have their sacredness and their purposefulness. And so, it's really about how we structure our identity. What feels safe, what doesn't feel safe, what makes a good human, what doesn't make a good human, what makes us somebody that people will appreciate, what doesn't, what circle are we in that can get us into a push-pull with ourselves and our emotions. So it's not like we don't have them. We all have them. We're human. These emotions arise as they're meant to. But then we're like, I want this more. I don't want this. I'm entitled to this. Like, I can't say how many people think that yelling at someone in anger is okay because they're being honest.
Right. Yeah, we've heard that one before. I'm just being honest. Like, no, you're
that's just how I am. No, not okay.
It's an action you're taking.
Something needs to be addressed here. Breathe.
And, when we have these large emotions and we're the kinds of people here having these conversations and wanting to find skillful ways to address them, just by way of wrapping up the conversation for those of you out there who are dealing with large emotions and willing and beginning to, or really turning towards them, one of the great gifts, besides whatever the gift of the emotion is to us in our lives, like besides what it's trying to birth in our actual lives, additionally, we become the people who can be skillful about our emotions, which doesn't mean looking constantly flatline calm. It means being a real human who feels all kinds of different things. And like, I think about this with my son, like the other morning he had to write a memoir for school and he printed it out and it was like something he's been working on for 2 months and then he crumples it in his backpack. And I'm like, August, seriously, you're handing it, so I have this moment of anger, right? Where I'm like, come on. He's like, I'm sorry. It's just that we're running late. This is just two normal human beings having a very normal interaction. And then what we did when we got in the car, because I'm the adult and because I've devoted my life to being skillful around emotions, is I'm able to go, okay, like I got pissy, that happened, that's okay, and sit down next to him and say, I'm sorry, my fuse is really short lately, and I would appreciate it if maybe you hand in your schoolwork in a more, tidy way. And he was like, it's okay. I'm sorry I got pissy back. That's just like a microcosm of people who are willing to be skillful around emotions, which doesn't mean I'm going to nail it 100% of the time. And I can tell you I don't. But then the world begins to be a place where there's just more of a representation. Like you were saying at the very beginning of the conversation, Vanessa, like we don't have this modeled very much. Being skillful about anger or being skillful about any emotion. But those of us who are willing to take the journey and willing to be real human beings with every variety of the spectrum of emotions and to own them and to be grown-ups about them, it does start to transform things. It does start to be visible.
Right. If you can relate to it without being overtaken by it. I think that's the thing. Emotions have a way of overtaking us, like I described about rage in the beginning, but we can get stuck in a lot of emotions that way. Like we can come to identify, I am the sad person, and sadness can overtake us. Like it's all we think about is sad thoughts. Like, if you recognize when John Prendergast, I don't know why he's coming up a lot for me today, but when he brings you into your heart and he's like, there's this part of you that already knows you're whole. And can it hold this other part? I mean, can you meet the other part? Well, all of these different things, and all sorts of teachers point to it in different ways, and you and I point to it in our ways. Like when you can recognize you're not just that emotion. There's something else, something larger, something more transcendent, something more at peace, something more in ease. Then you can relate with the energy instead of being overtaken by the energy. And in that relationship, clarity, discernment, movement can all be born differently. Thank you so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any of the resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. Just head over to the website and you'll see each episode's separate post. We put the resources right in there. come chat with us on Instagram and Facebook. There's lots of lively exchanges, and we really love seeing your faces there. Our member platform is at patreon.com/blissandgrit. Here you can donate to the show, which is so helpful in keeping this show going, and also get rewards for your support. If you've been wanting to engage with these topics in a deeper way, it's a great place to go for a more immersive experience, including a forum, meditations, and a beginner's guide to somatic spirituality. We're so grateful for the reviews you've all written and for the membership support so many of you have already provided, plus all the beautiful notes that so many of you send. We really hold you in our hearts with so much love and so much gratitude. We'll see you next week.